So, with a little bit of fear and trembling, we are continuing our worship series about gardening. It is scary being up here. If you don't believe me, try it. Because somehow I've got to bring this all together in ways that make sense. And we've just heard a very long passage from 1 Corinthians, which I'm sure you understood every single word, right? And I can just sit down now. Yeah. This is why we always pray. Me especially. Last Sunday, we started off by talking about seeds. Maybe some of you remember. We talked about how you and I are like little seeds. And a seed may not look like much, but God knows the potential that seed has. And in the same way, God knows the potential that each one of us have, even when you and I have trouble seeing it. And so we're like these little seeds, right? Nestled inside our skin coats. And I suspect that all of us have had times when we've been kind of glad to be in that safe cocoon, when it's felt good to retreat there because we feel safe. I get this feeling every single time I hear about yet another shooting at a local school. I just want to retreat and take all those kids with me so we can be safe. But there are other times, I'm sure, when we all want to retreat to someplace safe. Perhaps when somebody has actually hurt us. We all have this natural tendency to want to retreat. And then once we're there, it's really easy to get comfortable there and just settle in and not want to go anywhere else. And sometimes we kind of get stuck there, if we're honest. There are things going on around us and we're just not quite sure what to do, so we hide. You know, the credit card statement comes and, oh my goodness, who bought all that stuff? And how are we going to pay for it, right? Or we desperately want someone to love us because we feel so unloved and we don't know what to do. So we live in our little seed skins, our seed cocoons. And we can stay there a long time. What do we do? How do we break out? Well, we went through actually it wasn't that long, was it? The scientific method last Sunday. And we went through every step. And Jen reminded us that it's very important not to skip the research step, which I tried to sort of slide over without anybody noticing. But no, Jen says we should do research, and I think she's absolutely right. We can go to the library. That's probably a better source than Google. Or find an expert. If you're having trouble with your garden, go to the local extension society or find a master gardener. There are resources all around. We don't need to stay inside our little shells. We can dare to reach out and find someone who's got the information we're looking for. At church, our resource that we use the most is the Bible. And the Bible actually says a lot about how our lives are like a garden, like a plant. And if you noticed while we were listening to that first reading from 1 Corinthians that Bill read for us, he actually did talk about plants in there about halfway through. And I know his writing style can be really hard to follow. He used sort of a Greek method of question and answer, and that sometimes can get kind of hard to follow for us. And you have to admit that the way at the very beginning he yells, "Fool!" is a little off-putting. It's hard to listen to someone who just called you a fool. But in his defense, Paul's gotten kind of worked up by this point in his letter to that church in Corinth. He left them in good shape, and now he's getting all these reports back that they've gotten caught up on all kinds of petty squabbles. Plus, on top of all that, they're now starting to they're starting to believe in some just kind of weird stuff. And it's stuff that Paul didn't teach them. And so Paul is hearing about this, and he's getting kind of freaked out. While Paul was with these Christians, he told them about how Jesus was resurrected from the dead. And the people there seemed to have accepted that all right. So then Paul had gone on to tell them more, that not only Jesus was resurrected from the dead, but all of us also will die and come back to life. Apparently this has freaked out the church members in Corinth. Part of the trouble may be that in Greek, the phrase that we translate resurrection of the dead, if you translate it literally, it means rising of the corpses. Now there's something you just want to wrap your arms around, isn't it? Sounds like some kind of dreadful horror story. And I have promised to talk more about this at the end of November, so hold on to your hats. But for now, I want to talk about these poor people in Corinth. Their teacher, Paul, came and he taught them all these wonderful things, but then he threw in that whole thing about the rising of the dead. And these people in Corinth, these are Greeks. These are well-educated people, sophisticated people who have elevated spiritual lives, things of beauty. And so because they are so well-educated and live so much in their heads, like somebody I know very well, it's kind of hard to grasp some of these other things that Paul says. To believe that corpses that have been long dead can be resuscitated. So Paul has heard about all this, and he's trying to get them back on track. He writes them this letter, tries to help them understand what he meant about this whole concept of the resurrection of the dead. About how, just like Jesus, one day we too will get transformed bodies, new glorious ones, just like Jesus. And so poor Paul, he's trying to explain this to these people in Corinth, and he hits on this idea of gardening. He uses this metaphor of the seed becoming a seedling. Now we know something about this too, just like the Corinthians. You get a seed, right? Do you leave it on the windowsill forever and hope that it will grow into a plant? No. We plant the seed in the soil, right? Then that seed's going to need something more. What more is the seed going to need? Help me out here. Water, sun, right. And when it gets all these things over time, its little coat splits. And a little tiny root, I'm looking at my biologist to make sure I'm not telling you wrong things, a little tiny root comes out of the shell, and then also a stem or a shoot goes up out of this little tiny seed, up, and eventually breaks through the soil. It sprouts, and it becomes what we often call a seedling, right? So Paul is trying to make a connection between how a seed becomes a seedling to explain what happens with the resurrection of the dead. He says, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be, but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. A seed is buried in the soil and eventually becomes a seedling. It's still part of the seed, right? It's not a radically different thing. It's the same substance, it's just grown. When you and I look at a seed, if we hadn't seen seeds growing before, we would never dream that a little tiny seed could become a beautiful sunflower, for example. You would just never get from here to there if you hadn't seen it before. And it's the same way with our earthly bodies. We may not be happy with how it looks. It may look like a little tiny seed. But God knows the potential. God knows of the glorious sunflower that will emerge when Jesus returns again and the dead are raised. We won't be raised as little tiny seeds, but raised as beautiful new creatures with new bodies in ways that we can't even begin to imagine now. But of course, to do that, we have to break out of our seeds, don't we? We can't just stay there where it's safe and cozy. We have to dare to open up. When we feel the sun, God's sun, when we feel the warmth of Christ, that's our signal. We know it's safe to begin to emerge and to move toward the sun, to break out. With God's help, we can. We can dare to let loose, to break loose out of our seeds and grow toward the wonderful creatures that God is calling us to be. Thanks be to God. Amen.